Sticking feathers up your bum doesn't make you a chicken, apparently. What the hell am I talking about? I'm talking about support needs in this video. It's not a normal video about explaining a bit of the law, but it does have a bearing on the law, because what you find often is that people approach a council and make a homeless application, and they are then diverted away into the supported accommodation sector, which often has very bad outcomes for everyone. It's very expensive. And I've talked before about my time working in supported accommodation in Bedford, where people would enter the night shelter with very few support needs, and within a few weeks they had quite a few notable support needs because they've been exploited, because they've been introduced to heroin and crack, and their whole life trajectory was massively changed because they'd had that contact with a support service. Now, I've got to frame this a little bit and give it a bit of context to explain what it is I'm talking about. There's an old TED talk I've seen. I'll dig it out and put the link in the description. Basically, the speaker was talking about the linguistics and the study of language, and she basically, her research team went out and spoke to a bunch of Spaniards and a bunch of Germans who also spoke English as a second language, and they asked the Germans and the Spanish, they showed them a bunch of pictures of bridges, and they just said, look, in one word, how can you describe this bridge? And the Germans tended to use words that were associated with feminine qualities, so elegant, magnificent, beautiful, that sort of thing, whereas the Spaniards tended to use more masculine words like, you know, sturdy, strong, robust, or whatever. And the reason for that was, they thought, was because in German the word for bridge is a feminine word, whereas in Spanish it's a masculine word. And so they kind of started asking the question, to what extent does words shape our thinking about the world? And then they kind of went across to some research from Australia, where they were looking at a tribe of Aboriginals who didn't have a word for left and right. And basically, it seems that the fact they didn't have those words and instead would use north, east, south and west as a way to describe directions, left them with a very enhanced sense of direction. So for example, if you said to them, there's a spider crawling up your northeast leg, they would immediately know which one that was, because they're continually sort of kind of set in the world. They know which way's north and south and so on. And so that was a kind of clear way where actually language was not only kind of having an obvious effect, but it was somehow actually enhancing how those people's brains actually worked and how they would then sense the world. And that brings us back to this idea of support needs and support workers. And the reason I'm talking about this, or there's several reasons, but one of the main reasons I'm talking about this is that basically within the sector, there are often assessments you have to do. You have to do these multiple assessments, and one of the things they are assessing is your so-called support needs. It's even written in the Homelessness Reduction Act, actually, because part of that Section 189A assessment needs to look at what support you need to maintain future accommodation. And you're going to have these tick boxes, mental health issues, drug and alcohol issues, budgeting issues, debt, all that kind of stuff. Maybe like a list of 10 things, even to the point where you'll sometimes get asked whether you've been abused and that sort of thing within the assessment process. Not that that information does anything useful, by the way. They just ask it because they think they have to, but they don't even really know they're asking it. But yeah, so you kind of have this kind of paint by numbers understanding of people's lives. And one of the many problems with this is it has absolutely no predictive value whatsoever, in my experience, to say how well someone can maintain their own accommodation. So often what you see professionals doing is they'll say, oh, that person's using crack and heroin, they've got some long-term mental health issues, they can't maintain their own accommodation, when actually that is polar opposite of what's true. I think it does absolutely have a bearing on people's ability to maintain supported accommodation, ironically enough. That is to say, the more support needs you've got, the less likely it is you'll maintain supported accommodation, because of the additional requirements on your life, the rules and the kind of other people who are living there who might also have problems. But it has no bearing at all on someone's ability to maintain their own tenancy, or little bearing, let's say. And what that means is, and why it matters, is that professionals then write people off and say, well, look, this person's got too high support needs, they can't possibly make a homeless application or be supported into a tenancy, it would just be setting them up to fail. And I have always pushed back on that, and my experience in Bedford is that I have seen people who are assessed as unhousable, literally ticking every single support need on there, maintain their accommodation perfectly with literally no support whatsoever. And if people do need support, it's generally around managing and navigating the bureaucracy they have to manage, benefits, claiming benefits, the homeless application process itself, all that kind of stuff. That's what they actually need support with. And yet when you look at what most homeless charities do and what a lot of professionals do, is they kind of have this messiah complex, and I'm speaking from my own point of view here. When I started off working in the sector, I absolutely had that messiah complex. I saw people as having these support needs, and I was a support worker. Therefore, linguistically, my thinking was changed, and I thought I was somehow the answer to these people's problems. And I do wince about all of that, by the way. Now I really kind of regret most of what I did back then. But yeah, that's I think a lot of the sector's stuck in that model, and so you see all of these different schemes that are kind of popping up about ending homelessness and these new ideas, and they consistently avoid the obvious one, which is just get people housed. And again, there's so many kind of problems that you kind of see as a result of it. I'll put up a social media post I saw not too long ago from a homelessness charity. I won't name which one it was. In fact, I might just anonymise it to make it, so it's not obvious which one it was. And they were talking about this guy called William, or someone who they called William. It wasn't his real name. And this was a low support need supported accommodation provider. And it basically said, isn't it great? William has been able to get his own property after 5 years of living with us. Wasn't that support so essential? Essentially, what kind of said, you kind of read it for yourself what the actual words were. Now, that 5 years in supported accommodation in itself would have been horrendously expensive. I don't know exactly how much, but I would say between £50,000 and £100,000 over the 5 years, because that's literally just how much housing benefit cost. And it's really interesting to think how that money could have been better used for that person. Bearing in mind this is a low support needs hostel, that is to say that people with high support needs aren't able to get in there in the first place. So this is probably someone who ticked some kind of low level support need, or maybe a couple of support needs, and yet the charity is taking credit for that person then being able to find and maintain their own accommodation. And that's just something which is, you see it throughout the sector. And as I say, it's very, very harmful to people who actually enter into the sector. We talk about this revolving door of homelessness. It's all around supported accommodation. It's not around people's tenancies. Most people are able to obtain safe, settled, suitable, affordable, self-contained accommodation, will not become homeless again. Or if they will do, it's because of no fault evictions, or it's because something has happened outside their control. Whereas people who move into the supported accommodation sector will basically get trapped in this kind of, sort of almost like fractional distillation service kind of setup, where you kind of got this staircase model. I get that word from the Housing First kind of research, and Housing First does have a bearing on this. Although, as an aside, I would say that Housing First is interesting because I don't think that basically the support actually needs to be as intense as they make out. Because when you see Housing First providers, they'll talk about, we need to go and see little Jimmy every day of the week for the next 6 years, and it's like, well, I'm not sure if you actually need to do that. And I've had some very bizarre conversations with people who are steeped in this kind of language, where they'll say, Housing First works for the people with really high support needs, but it doesn't work for other people with lower support needs. And I'm like, no, it works for everyone, 100%. That's just bizarre that you're kind of thinking like that. But I think they're just trapped in this kind of idea of support needs and kind of all the language that we use in the sector that just doesn't help us think freely about it. So what I guess I'm trying to say is, I don't know what the answer to this problem is. I just know that there's a problem, and I'd really love to hear what people have got to say about it. I'd be really interested to see any kind of research or any kind of books about this kind of idea, because it just seems that so many professionals are trapped in this kind of thing. And again, it's important because if the sector can't escape this kind of thinking, then we're never going to end homelessness. We're always going to see the problem as being the individual with their support needs rather than the lack of housing. We're always going to find increasingly expensive and ridiculous ways to deal with this, which actually doesn't deal with it at all. And it just basically means that a whole bunch of people get trapped and chewed up and kind of left in a much worse situation than they were when they kind of came into the sector. I've only worked with a handful of people. I say less than a handful of people. I think I can think of 3 people who chose supported accommodation over having their own tenancy. At least one of which immediately regretted it, because as soon as they got in there, they're like, this is ridiculous. And what a lot of people moving into supported accommodation don't get told is, or don't get an honest answer about, is how long they need to actually live there before they can move on. And as I say, they just become reduced to these numbers, these kind of name on a bit of paper sort of thing. And staff just seem to lose the ability to actually treat them as human beings. I'll talk more about that in other videos, particularly around things like data protection and stuff like that. But again, there's a lot more to say about that. But it just seems to be, it's incredibly expensive. It's incredibly ineffective, as in it's probably worse than having nothing at all. And it actually just acts as a distraction on on society, because society gets a lot of their understanding of homelessness through these charities who are always going on about how these people need our support and pay us money so we can go and support these people some more. when the reality is they don't need it. They just don't need it, basically. Really, as I say, a lot of the time the actual support is needed is just to navigate the bureaucracy, which, the answer to that is just don't have these ridiculous bureaucratic systems. Just scrap the whole lot and just basically make sure there's enough housing for everyone. You are going to be able to deal with the vast majority of people who become homeless then effectively. They are going to be able to escape homelessness themselves, have community, have friends themselves without having to kind of have, be befriended or kind of that sort of language from services. And I just think it's better for everyone. But I think as long as we have this kind of language of support needs and we see it through these lenses, as I say, I was completely guilty of this for many years, but unless we can break free of that, I just can't see us actually tackling homelessness effectively. And I think, as I say, it actually stops us doing so because we're just fixated on people's support needs and everything that kind of comes out of that. So yeah, if you've got any thoughts about this, I'd be fascinated to know what they are. Stick them in the comments. I may well do some follow-up about this at some point, but it just seems to be something that's been on my mind recently, and I just thought it might be interesting to throw out there to see what other people think. If you've got experiences of supported accommodation, I'd be particularly interested in what you have to say about it, and it would certainly just help me, I think, just kind of process this a bit more and maybe have a bit more clarity of thought over it. So yeah, thanks for watching. I'd be really interested to see what you've got to say about it.